All right, I think we're all back here, so we can jump in and keep on track here. All right, so here we go into our section on new criticism, and we've already seen a little bit of someone like Northrop Frye coming out of that moment. Now we get to put our heads, we can sort of put some of the linguistics to the side to some extent. It'll help us, especially next week. But now we're looking more, we're back in the English department. So we've left linguistics. We're back in our English department, and we're asking ourselves the questions that they are asking themselves in this moment of our first reading is from the 1930s. And that is, what do English departments do? And do they have a set of rules or methods that they all agree that they use? And they should, because that's what a department is. That's what constitutes a sort of field of study, a field of knowledge. So new critics are a group of people who really wanted to sit down and map this out for the first time. I say that for the first time because really before 1920s or so, you did not have really what we would call the modern English department. Or it is coalescing, let's say around 1910s and 20s. But up until then, a lot of times in the English department, you would have a lot of philologists, people studying the history of the English language. You would have a lot of, let's say, textual editing. You would have even some maybe biographers, but generally, a suite of literary teachers, which is what we have now. We don't have most of what I just described, had yet to really take hold, and it really starts to become an issue right around the 1910s and 20s. That's what the English department is taking shape as. And it is at the same time as I would say the whole university is really starting to coalesce into the modern university. So I was actually just walking on UC Berkeley, in the city of Berkeley, and there are some buildings that were erected right around like 1900, and they chiseled in the department names. And like there was a department of botany, but we don't have that anymore. Right now it's just sort of, it got folded into biology. Just like philology would have been chiseled in maybe as a department. It got folded where? Not actually in the English department, but eventually into linguistics. I can't remember, there was some other sort of older scientific fields that no longer really exist that sort of represent, again, the university coalescing right around the turn of the century into this thing that is the modern identified university that we understand as. Second, to understand a little bit what new criticism is, it's coming out of the moment of modernism as well. So this is 1920s, 1930s. Modernist writers are expanding on what constitutes literature. They're writing new forms, or they're inventing new forms for literature. And so it really throws into the question, what is literature at all? There's, of course, famous poems or James Joyce thing, where it's like you grab, words from a newspaper, put it into a novel, now it's literature. Right? So you're really pushing the line of what is the difference between literary and non-literary, forcing us to ask the question once again, what is literature and how do you read it? A lot of the new critics themselves are writers, poets or fiction writers, but they're also professors, and they're trying to understand what is their role as professor, which is different than as artist or as writer. A question that I think will return to us over and over again because they thought there would be an important difference between a writer and a professor of writing or literature. So a maker of literature and a professor of literature. And they thought there would be an important difference and that should be explained. And even today, we're not sure how to make sense of that. Is there a difference between a writer and a professor of literature? I will even admit that I come into the class and I tell my students, all writing you're doing is creative writing. Whether you're writing an essay, which seems very boring to you, and not particularly creative, I don't care. It's all a form of creativity to some degree. And I do not like a hard and fast distinction between literature and other forms of writing, like an essay. I find essays creative. However, I also don't want to collapse and just say, well, this essay is fiction, if you will, or this is poetry. No, it's still an essay, but that didn't mean it wasn't a form of creative writing. So I'm willing to push some of these questions further, and yet also not totally remove some of these boundaries at the same time. And I think the new critics are interested in some of that as well. As they are developing their methods, we might sum up the entirety of what they're doing as what we call close reading today. But they're essentially inventing close reading. How do you do close reading? What does that mean? What does that look like? They don't have that phrasing yet, and they're sort of inventing it as they're proceeding. Okay, so let's take a look at John Crowe Ransom's understanding of what he does for a living. On 901, Criticism Inc. So I'll read and pause here with some questions. He says from the get-go, "It is strange, but nobody seems to have told us what exactly is the proper business of criticism. There are many critics who might tell us, but for the most part they are amateurs. So have the critics nearly always been amateurs, including the best ones. They have not been trained into criticism, so much as they simply undertaken a job for which no specific qualifications were required. It is far too likely that what they call criticism, when they produce it, is not the real thing. There are three sorts of trained performers who would appear to have some competence that the critic needs. The first is the artist himself. He should know good art when he sees it, but his understanding is intuitive rather than dialectical. He cannot very well explain his theory of the thing. It is true that literary artists with the command of language are better critics of their own art than are other artists. Probably the best critics of poetry we can now have are the poets. But one can well imagine that any artist's commentary on the artwork is valuable in the degree that he sticks to its technical effects, which he knows minutely and about which he can certainly talk if he will." I'll just pause there and I'll ask you. Okay, so he's going to say, all right, nobody understands, he says, the business of criticism. There might be three people we can refer to who have sort of the best understanding of what criticism is. First would be the artists themselves. What, though, is his qualification? Why is he not so sure that they are the best, let's say, critics or people involved in the business of criticism? What did he tell us in this first paragraph there? Julia and then Dan.
I'd say because he puts more emphasis on the artist's intuitive, personal, and subjective ability to create their own art. So it's almost like the ability to do something doesn't mean that you can't talk about how you can why you do things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's that lacking of explaining of the how, if it's intuitive or if it's personal. It might also be sort of, if you can't explain, if you can't tell or teach other people how to do it, then there's a gap between what you're doing and what we might call criticism. And that can't be traversed just by the artist talking about his own work or his or her own work. What else did you say?
That pretty much sums it up for me, but what Julia said. But something I thought was interesting about this paragraph is that I disagree. I disagree that they're better critics of their own art than are other artists.
Yeah,
like it kind of. Yeah, like it just seems like he's sort of contradicting himself. Like the artist understands things intuitively, not dialectically, not logically, not analytically. And they'll be really great critics of their own art. I think that's like, if anything, it would be the opposite.
Yeah, he's maybe giving a lot of, let's say, credence to artists talking about their own works.
Yeah.
I think maybe the obvious problem with that, were that to be the best reader of a work, it's just that they couldn't read anybody else's work very well. So if we model all of literary criticism on the artist knows best about the artwork, we might agree with that, or maybe we might not, but all that would get us would be a one-to-one relationship, okay? Whereas we want to be able to talk about it if we didn't write it, okay? So that, and most people are going to be in that situation. They're going to read a work that they didn't write, and you're reading all novels, and everyone in the, on the planet are reading various works that they didn't write, so it's not going to be that useful to them to have the skills that the artist would to say, I can talk about my own work really well. So that, again, a difference between the artwork and the literary criticism versus the literature. Maybe it's not even true that the artist is actually the best explainer of their own work anyways. That's going to be a big deal for Clayton Brooks. Sorry, not Clayton Brooks, for Wimsatt and Beardsley, when they talk about what's called the intentional fallacy. The author's intention may not be the best explanation of the work. But that comes about 2 or 3 decades after this argument. Right. So it's kind of a response to some of this. Okay, let's take a look at the second example. He says that is the philosopher who should know all about the function of the fine arts. But the philosopher is apt to see a lot of wood and no trees, for his theory is very general and his acquaintance with particular works of art is not persistent and intimate, especially his acquaintance with their technical effects. Or at least, I suppose so, for philosophers have not proved that they can write close criticism by writing it. And I have a feeling that even their handsome generalizations are open to suspicion as being grounded more on other generalizations, those which form their prior philosophical stock than on acute study of particulars. Okay, so what's his problem with philosophers? Why aren't they good readers of literature? Sorry.
Their ideas are too big.
Too big or too generalized or too forest for the specific trees, if that's the right metaphor for this. Okay, what else?
Yeah, they're not grounded in the writing itself. So we can use them for general concepts,
Yeah.
but to look at the actual literature,
Yeah.
we're working down, we're
Yeah.
funneling down rather than
Exactly,
going up.
yeah. So, not just what is, an elegy or tragedy, actually Nietzsche's very good on that, but what about this particular Shakespearean text? And what about this particular line? And this, and these words and these metaphors? Like, we need to go, have a high degree of specificity and particularity to really get the most out of a particular text. But if we just said, oh, guess what, it's a tragedy, that's the general thing you need to know about it, you're missing a vast amount of what that text is doing.
He also kind of makes the claim that even their larger ideas are kind of shaky because they're based on other generalizations.
Exactly.
Just going backwards of your philosophy is based off of other philosophy, which is based off of other philosophy.
Yeah, which itself may be too abstract and not really a good understanding of even elegy or tragedy or whatever. If you're also just sort of saying, well, it's what Aristotle said, right? It's really not that helpful. Why is that the authority? And of course, Aristotle doesn't know Shakespeare or any, and so on. So there's, it's gonna be generalization after generalization. That's the model you're using. Okay, so all right, pretty straightforward. Why he doesn't think philosophers are all that impressive. All right, let's finally. The third is the university teacher of literature, who is style professor and who should be the very professional we need to take charge of the critical activity. He is hardly inferior as a critic to the philosopher, and perhaps not on the whole to the poet. But he is a greater disappointment because we have the right to expect more of him. Professors of literature are learned, but not critical men. The professional morale of this part of the university staff is evidently low. It is as if, with conscious or unconscious cunning, they had appropriated every avenue of escape from their responsibility, which was decent and official, so that it is easy for one of them, without public reproach, to spend a lifetime in compiling the data of literature, and yet rarely or never commit to himself to a literary judgment. Nevertheless, it's from professors of literature in this country, professors of English for the most part, that I should hope eventually for the erection of intelligent standards of criticism. It is their business. Criticism must become more scientific or precise and systematic, and this means that it must be developed by the collective and sustained efforts of learned persons, which means that its proper seat is in the universities. And then he goes a little bit more in scientific, and we already talked a little bit about that. We see that recurring claim over and over again. It's not that important. He says it's an exact, but not a it's not a perfectly exact, but a nearly exact one, and so on. But wait a second. Why are professors of literature not doing very well? Why is the morale low? Why are they a disappointment? And he's not talking about contemporary English departments. He's talking about 1930s English departments. But it does feel familiar. Morale might be low even now. We'll get to that later. Why is morale so low in the 1930s? What is he getting at? Why is he sort of throwing a lot of these literature professors under the bus? And he finds them very disappointing. You get a sense of why that is. That's it.
I think he says later that he's kind of annoyed that they're not focused on the work itself, but they're kind of focused on the context of the work.
Very good. Absolutely, yeah. So he's going to spend a lot of time sort of coming up with a set of typical sort of figures or characters you'll find in the English department, and some of them might be historians, and who are constantly trying to say, all right, well, in the time of Chaucer, this is what was going on historically and maybe even linguistically, and then let's say religiously, and then let's say in terms of your professional position and so on and so forth. And all this context and history, well, what about the actual tales? those come very, very late. He says sometimes, I think it was in this essay, where he says like sometimes you get like 5% literature, or the aesthetic, he says, and then 95% history. So that's one of the reasons why they're disappointing to him. Other reasons why literature professors are, the morale is low and they are a disappointment according to him. Anything else you want to point out? All right. Well, okay. Then I think the related question is that let's just at least articulate to ourselves, what does he mean by criticism? What's his definition of criticism? Tim Lincoln.
He sort of makes it seem like as some sort of judgment on the uses of like literary technique,
Mm-hmm.
like if they did a good job or not.
Okay. The technique of a particular novel or poem, if it was achieved well, if it was accomplished well, but then even emphasis on the how is this object made, in that sense, by technique. How did this poem get put together? How does this poem work? These are all sort of ways of talking about the technique. Okay, so far so good. What else, Kelly, you want to add?
Something similar, so criticism is maybe breaking down a text into its parts.
Mhm.
And maybe that's why I use the analogy of the artist. Like an artist when a white guy makes yellow and red to make orange, and that's why this piece is that way.
Yeah, so understanding the parts of a poem to achieve the bigger picture or the whole, how the part and the whole relate, might be a good definition of criticism. It's interesting, what the perpetual crisis of the literature department is that we still struggle to define what criticism is. And this is what he's trying to go through. And so what is he offering us? Here's some examples. Here's on 903, he says at the bottom. So starting the last paragraph, he says, he's talking about new humanists. He's not particularly excited about them. They're really moralists. More accurately, they're historians and advocates of certain moral systems. It's not that important why he's unhappy with them, other than the fact that they like to talk more about morals than they do, like, let's say, the technical aspects of text. And here's his point about defining criticism. He says, criticism is the attempt to define and enjoy the aesthetic or characteristic values of literature. And that's, again, I think what we're talking about, some of this sort of how does that poem work? How is it made? That would be some of the aesthetic and values of the literature. Let's see if I can find some other ways he's defining criticism. In a little bit, he will offer what criticism is not, near the end of the essay, what criticism is not. I suppose I'll get to that in just a minute. But there, even the positive definition of criticism is he's struggling with. He's wanting to point to what he calls a scientific or precise, systematic way of understanding how literature works, a professional way of approaching literature, and often he has to rely on what it's not. It's not what artists are doing. It's not what philosophers are doing. It's not what these humanists are doing. It's not what political leftists or proletarians are doing, because they're looking for a kind of moral of a particular poem or literature. Does it help class consciousness? Does it help the proletariat? Okay, that's what they're reading for, but they're not reading for the aesthetic values or the technical construction of the poem or the sort of nuts and bolts of how this poem or novel is put together. I want to pause, though, on the word business for a little bit. It's in that first sentence. It says, what is the proper business of criticism? This essay is called Criticism, Inc. And he, on page 902, kind of points to that. He says, rather than occasional criticism by amateurs, this is right in the middle of 902, I should think that the whole enterprise might be seriously taken in hand by professionals. Perhaps I use a distasteful figure, but I have the idea that what we need is Criticism, Inc. or Criticism Limited. And he says, actually, he thinks, strangely enough, professors might resist this. But hold on, why this metaphor of business or incorporated or limited business language? Why is he using that over and over again? What do you think he's doing there? Go ahead, Sue.
Because it creates like it's a unifying principle, right?
Okay.
If you create Criticism Inc., then everybody who's operating under it has the same goal and
Mhm.
like,
Yeah,
set
necessary.
of structures to
Yeah.
guide them.
Yeah, so if everyone incorporated is producing, like semiconductor chips, they all have one goal, to produce the best semiconductor. Well, why can't we in an English department have a similar goal, which is to have precise, systematic, intelligent standards of criticism? So we should all have that as our collective goal. Therefore, we might see ourselves as a business or a business metaphor. We're all sort of gathered in that project. Okay. All right. So far, so good. Other reasons why you think he's using this business metaphor? And as you're thinking about it, I mean, do you think of yourself as, is that metaphor helpful for you? Is the English department a kind of business? How are you responding to this, Julie?
My immediate thought was the production mindset, being able to say, what do we do in the English department? Oh, we make something applicable, we make
Mhm.
something helpful instead of.
We manufacture helpful readings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of, anything or all the rest that we do.
Rather than, let's say, subjective, celebrations, right? We don't just, enjoy or appreciate one by one poems or whatever, and say what you enjoy is great, what I enjoy is great. Let's sort of appreciate that relativistic, situation in which each person has their own enjoyment. In Ransom's view, that is a big failing. He hasn't really fully articulated that sense, but that would be a version of the amateur. If everyone is an amateur, they all have their own methods, their own reasons for reading, their own enjoyment for the text, their own affirmation or celebration of it for their own purposes, and that's as far as you get, then that's not, if you will, a business or a profession or a method, or as he says, that's not intelligent standards of criticism that are precise and systematic. It's the opposite. It's sort of anything goes, and it's preferential based, and it's amateur, according to him. Samantha? Great, sorry, great.
I
Okay.
was just gonna say that, when I first read it, the word business just implied to me a sort of capitalistic gain, which I'm not sure how well it
Yeah.
goes into the rest of it, but I don't know, it's sort of in this time where he feels disappointed by professors to sort of try to create some system of capitalistic gain as a way of creating value to the field and the department.
So you think he actually, so he's picking up a capitalist metaphor that he thinks that we should agree to and find actually beneficial and helpful for us, and that is to sort of make value. Science is a business. They don't have any problem seeing this as in the business metaphor model. They produce knowledge, which directly translates to new inventions or whatever like that, or helpful things in the world. Other even the humanities, let's say psychology, can give you therapy, or they can help you become better learners or something like that. So the English should have a similar productive, useful, capitalist value-making model. It's implicit. He doesn't theorize capitalism very well here, but he's seems like all for it. This is 1930s America. So he thinks that it would be a good thing that if the entire English departments were structured as such. And do we still believe this? All right, Vincent and Tina.
I think also by making it kind of like a business, that means only certain people are in the business.
Yes.
Like he goes on later where he goes over the things that aren't part of criticism. So he's kind of he wants to create an in-group of people who can do correct criticism by his standard, and then to exclude all those other people that wouldn't be part of that.
Yeah. I think that's right. That's sort of the implications. He might say that he's he's not saying amateurs are wrong or useless, but professors have trained and, let's say, systematic and more precise approaches to the literary. And that should be highly valued in a way that is different than everyone else's sort of approach to literature. So you are right. You're detecting absolute sort of separation of the university. He says that this should take place in English departments, which are universities, so it's a separation of the university from, the famous town versus gown. So the town, the amateur, the book club, often gendered as female. So the amateur is often gendered and, if you will, feminized as not producing important enough value. It's very subjective and it's very opinion-based, whereas the professional has separated him or herself from that model. And it's sort of a masculine, kind of patriarchal figure of the business leader who has achieved a higher knowledge and expertise, and that is worthy of the correct value because it actually delivers proper criticism. So that's kind of what you're hinting at, right? And the question is, do we agree with that? Do we want to reproduce that? Is that something that we still think is the English department? So Tina.
Oh, actually, I have a minor comment.
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Metaphor of business. I think that he wanted to give a definition of criticism, but he's doing harm because, for me at least, business is associated with mass production, like incorporation or limited. They are both associated with mass production. It's not production. So with literature, are we allowed to do this? Like mass production does fit literature or not? Because it doesn't. If, for example, take nowadays, if we look at those scholarly works that have been done on Shakespeare, we see that we squeezed Shakespeare to the extent that there's nothing left. This is the mass production of criticism on Shakespeare.
There's 10,000 monographs on Shakespeare, and
exactly.
we need 10,00001. And so if you have a business model, it's actually not so much about productivity, but maybe about quality or, and as such. I'll get to your in just a second, Dakota, because one of the fascinating things about new criticism is that there's something actually quite politically radical about these arguments, even using the business metaphors. And it leads into what you were saying, Tina, because what they might say is that it's not about producing criticism, it's about, let's say, the sharing of it, that it's accessible to anybody. Meaning that, more and more people are going to university, so classrooms are bigger, we have more students. How are we going to service all these needs? It's sort of like a business service model. By having good quality criticism. So it's not necessarily about producing another 10,000 Shakespeare readings, but it's about teaching 10,000 students well. And if we're going to do that, we're going to need a method that's not about, hey, everyone in this room, all your readings are good. We can't, that's totally total relativism, total arbitrariness, and totally giving up on any form of method, systematic method. So he's trying to say that, we should see the university in the sense of servicing more and more students. Technically, there's also a little bit of sense of the competition. Like, if we don't service them well, in our business, they'll go to the business of films, or they'll go to the business of, of classics or philosophy or whatever. We'll lose them, and that's still the model of most universities, including this one. Right? We get essentially paid by the number of students in the room, and so on. And the funding that falls to you as graduate students is also based on that too. So there is a business, and one should be aware of that. But he's more still on the metaphor of it all, and that I think it's the idea that we should have a professional way of reaching out to any number of students out there, and we shouldn't, like, some of his language I forget exactly, but sort of escape the responsibility of that potential, massive amount of students that we might service or something like that. And this is why I call it radically. It's sort of democratically radical new criticism. They believe that sort of anybody can be taught literature and be taught it well. However, they also are undemocratic by really putting a lot of, again, stress on professionalization. That only, well-trained scholars are going to be the best at doing this. So you have to balance which one you think it is in terms of, is it politically helpful or politically not helpful, or both maybe. Ducati, though, you wanted to add something.
I was going to echo back on Vincent's point, because I think part of our commentary is coming from seeing that ivory tower built up so strongly and feeling like it's become more of an isolationist method than one that does that democratic work. And interestingly enough, I think I've seen there's this desire to latch on in this to science as the model.
Yeah.
And I've seen through my own interdisciplinary work, science critique itself for that,
Yeah.
for being professionalized. When I did my MA thesis, I had a biology professor as my secondary reader.
Yeah.
And he said one of the things that he was inspired by was this idea that science has been built foundationally like a pyramid, building on itself, building on itself, building on itself. And we're at a point where we're reflexively wondering, okay, who got left out of this conversation?
Yeah.
And shouldn't we stop this building for a second, or at least consider it, to ask who isn't in this and what are we missing in that? And I think there's a similar thing that we could argue about literary studies by saying, okay, if we only take those who match our language and our professionalization,
Yeah.
whose voices are we going to leave out? And what are we building up?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's important to have a sort of critical sense of what professionalization might mean all through the next 100 years of this English department. We're getting from 1930 to 2024. And absolutely. On the other hand, he would say, though, that yet we have professionalization classes now. So we still believe in professionalization and that this is we use that word, it's a profession. If it's a profession, it's no different than any other professional job out there, i.e. business job or whatever you want to call it, whatever metaphor you want to use. And if that's true, we should own up to what our profession is. And therefore we should recognize our expertise and we should train ourselves accordingly. Even knowing, though, that what we define as expertise might actually change over time, and we might say, wait, some people got left out of that model of profession and expertise and so on. And that's a good thing that we do. You may know that there was a book that came out 2 years ago by John Guillory, a well-known English professor, called Professing Criticism, I believe it's called. And he makes a huge deal out of that word profession and the word criticism, essentially taking from this very essay right here in front of us and revisiting all the above and saying we are both. We do literary theory and we are profession at the same time. And we have to understand what that really means. It means training. It means exactly everything that John Crowe Ransom thought. And it is not wrong to use business metaphors, even if we're very uncomfortable with the capitalist metaphor of associations of it. And I'll finally say, I got an English program because I didn't want to get a job. Right? That's why we're all English majors, or and so on. I hate the business world. I like reading novels and poems because I never could see myself as a 9-to-5, and I had 9-to-5 jobs, and it was a disaster, and that's the whole point. The English degree is all about questioning that, deconstructing that model that everyone's a business person and so on, and it's about trying something radically different. Saying, wait a second, value isn't usefulness or how it gets you a job or how it delivers some product to somebody, but in the world of literature, we stop and think about all the other questions that got left out. What is it? How do we appreciate being alive? How do we appreciate something like beauty or any given emotion we might find? How do we enjoy things like contact? How do we understand just all these sort of effects that happen when someone relates a beautiful poem, an addressee or something like that, and so on. And it's all about moving out, finding everything out that got left out of that business mentality. Maybe, on the other hand, I have to admit that this is a paying job, or you were paid as TAs and so on. So there is professionality no matter where one goes.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come into the conversation as well. I was just to bounce off what's already been said, like Dakota talking about what's been left behind, and I was just thinking about criticism making. It reminded me of what you said earlier in the class. I don't know if you said all writing is creative writing, or
yeah, that's maybe it.
Yeah, all. I think maybe all good writing is creative. All good writing is creative writing. But yeah, and the incorporated nature, I think, sort of does turn things into turn us into part cogs or part of a system that could be identical. So I think
It has
that
that
sort of brings a bit, it's not
Problem,
really creative. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
feel like part of what's great about literary study is that I think and you're always, at least maybe I am, I'm just sort of always trying to break the rules or challenge them. And I think like that gives you a better understanding of them, and then also
Fair enough.
produces good work.
Yeah.
And then but on the other side, I'm actually kind of two minds of it. I don't want to totally shoot down criticism ink. I mean, I think it's funny, but it's also I remember about a year ago, Nick and I and a few others were talking about what we do here, and we were talking about production specifically. I remember you saying, I remember you saying to me, so you think we should be producing? And I said yes. And I do.
Yeah, we all should be writing.
believe
I don't.
that.
Yeah, we should
like,
be writing
I
and
think-
talking and reading.
I think we should be writing. Like I don't think we should totally dismiss Ransom's point because he's saying like we need, especially at this point, he's saying we English professors need to be more than fact memorizers about literary context. Like we have to push that conversation, and I feel like the only, like you can read and think as much as you want, but
If
writing,
you're not sharing it in public, and
yeah,
then
writing
it's-
is when
it's
it
lost
happens.
to history.
Yeah, writing is how everything happens
Yeah.
to me. So
Yeah.
I'm still kind of like,
Yeah, I think these are all huge points. And by the way, to the degree that we all recognize creativity as sort of what we do to some degree, you can see the paradigms have shifted, from this language of precise, systematic, scientific, and so on to a little bit more creative. But paradoxically, we want to be more precise and systematic about our creativity still. So it's not like we've totally abandoned some of this early, impetus. All right, well, 2 more points, but we still have 2 texts to go to, so it's going to be really tricky here. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I like that you said you don't want to get rid of it entirely, because I think too there are lots of like useful things in that sense, not just of like the work that you produce as a professional, but also like even in like students, right? If you think about like what new criticism is really useful for, that kind of direct like reduction to the text itself is like, that's what you, but if someone's gonna take one English class, right? That critical skill of being able to say what's in the text itself is like what you're setting up.
And they go from
Yeah.
a level of expertise, they gain an
Yeah.
expertise from, a very vague understanding of how this text is important to, it's moved up in level. It's become more professional, if that's what I want to say it, but that's a good thing.
Yeah, so it's
Very-
like also like the production
Yeah.
of critical thinkers. I
Yeah,
guess.
because we would not want a system in which, everyone stayed at the same level. Like, all readings were equally valued, they were all equally interesting because they're not, and we have achieved no level of, so if you will, better judgment or expertise, or if you will, professionalized reading or something like that, precise reading. Julie, did you want to add something?
I did, but I.
All right, we'll come back. Okay, hopefully we'll come back. But anyways, I'm going to rush through. Final point on Ransom is that on page 908, he does ask himself once again, what is criticism? That would be helpful to help, give us a real definition, Mr. Ransom. He says, easier to ask, what is criticism not? So, it's actually quite a frustrating essay, given how much weight he's putting on that. And he finally says again, it's not personal registrations or anything goes readings or my personal reactions to it. It is not synopsis and paraphrase. We're going to see that in just a second, the heresy of paraphrase. It's not historical studies, the author's biography or background or context. It's not linguistic studies or philology. It's not moral studies or, I value this because I believe in Christianity, or I believe in, communism, or I believe in any particular moral, presuppositions. So it's not moral confirmation of my own moral values. Or it's not moral conversion. Hey, guess what? I'm a communist. I'm going to teach you to be communist. This is the sort of the caricature that all right-wing people think about the English department. It's conversion, and it's telling you what morals to believe in, and so on and so forth. And so already that's a factor. And Ransom's like, whether it's from the right or from the left, he's actually very critical of that moralization. The problem is the right wing says that it's conversion and blah, 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 but the right wing would like their version of conversion. Like, so they have not self-criticized their own moralization. It's like they don't like your morals, but actually their morals are just perfectly fine. If the English department just would teach, their version of moral values, they would accept that. finally, and he says any other special states. So interesting, again, he's struggling with actually defining what the heck criticism is. Though he says finally it's the technique or he says the technical studies of poetry, for example, metric, inversions, solstices, blah, blah, 9, 10. As we're leaving this particular reading behind, I actually don't, I should have said this in the flow of the debate, but it has lingered in my mind. Maybe we'll talk about it more later, but I hate the word criticism. I never call myself a critic. I don't like that word. I think most people associate what I do as criticism, and I can't stand it. I like the word critique, actually. I like the word critical theory. Half my life is in the theory center at this university. I loved critique. I just don't like the word criticism, and it's just weird. Maybe it's just me. I don't know if it's you, but I just think I associate it too much with like film critics who are like, "This is a bad film movie. This is a great movie." That's not what I do. I don't say this is good literature and bad literature, but it's got that automatic association. Also, when I read a text, I'm not trying to criticize it. That's really not the model or word or let's say affect I have. I am trying to certainly understand it, but also say something that you don't already assume is sort of immediately present in the text. Because then I don't feel like I'm teaching anybody anything. So I'm trying to add something to it. If I'm adding, is that called criticism? I just don't think it's the right word. So I do not self-identify with that word. Maybe you're different. Yeah.
I was just saying, like, when you say add something, this essay has been kind of screwed up a little bit because it's like you kind of have value.
I am. Absolutely. I make value. I would definitely agree with that.
Right. You get a raise. That criticism.
Thank you. The more value I add.
You are trying to add value then.
Yeah, I am. I agree with that. Yeah, I believe.
I guess I'm making the comment because I first heard criticism and I'm like, screw that.
It sounds dry.
Like,
yeah.
I'm not good at science, and I don't like business. That's why I'm into it, right? So, but I'm kind of buying into it. Like me.
Well, that we should see ourselves as, again, having a method, having a shared project called the English department, and also having a sense that this is more valuable and this is less valuable, so that we can assess value. Okay, we can still question those, what's more and less. I still have a good thing that I think actually Shakespeare is more interesting than a TV commercial. So I do rate different values to some degree, but I also think, in Shakespeare you have, again, like the newspaper thrown in, so it's essentially commercials. Or like James Joyce is taking commercials that he's finding in Dublin and putting them in the text. So, I can throw that back at myself and say, commercials can be literature, yes, fine. And I also think that when I write an essay, I want to add value to the world. I want to make the world more valuable. I want to, make people feel that they got a sense of value out of what I said. It's funny enough that value is one of Nietzsche's keywords. As you know, I'm going through a Nietzschean crisis, and Nietzsche's like, you should just make values. He's like, he was against moral standards to a large degree because he said, these are arbitrary. Who told you that the human being does this? Especially since human beings are going to be gone soon, in effect. So you're free to choose a sense of moral value because, there is no God, and not only, that's one thing. Second, though, it's just sort of the powerful telling you what to do. If they're saying your values should be, patriarchy, or he doesn't actually say patriarchy, it wouldn't be one of his, but even one of the values he hates is democracy or socialism, because for him it's again someone telling you that this is the project of humanity is to achieve this, and he's like, humanity has no project, but it doesn't mean you do nothing. That's called nihilism. It just means you have to make value. You have to produce value, and he calls this the revaluation of values. And I actually think that makes a lot of sense. That's called as the aesthetic, is making the world a more valuable place, even though we know those are temporary values. And whether or not they last or disappear is not as important as making the value itself. And that is the creative act itself. Creativity is that sort of valuation thing. Even if even for Nietzsche, like the whole world is tragic. The universe is tragic. We'll all die, and we have no purpose, and yet we can still have value in the moment, in the now. And I totally am down with that. And I can even call that professionalization. in a weird way. So let's see, though, in the very slim time we have to do 2 last readings, we're going to do it 10 minutes each. Clarence Brooks, The Well-Wrought Urn. It's okay because it's fairly straightforward. He's going to call, this section's on what he calls the heresy of paraphrase. So 1183. This is 50s, I think. But you can see this as him saying, yeah, we should be professionals, and here's some of our professional rules. We will not paraphrase. And the question is, why not? And I'm just sort of going to jump around. At the very bottom of 1183, he says the following. All right, it says, it should be readily apparent that common goodness which poems share will have to be stated, not in terms of content or subject matter in the usual sense in which we use these terms, but rather in the terms of structure. The content of the poems is various, and if we attempt to find one quality or content which is shared by all the poems, a poetic subject matter, or diction, or imagery, we shall find that we have merely confused the issues. For what is it to be poetic? In the schoolroom of Yeats's poetic poem, or sorry, is the schoolroom of Yeats' poem poetic or unpoetic? Shakespeare's newborn babe, striding the blast, poetic, whereas the idiot of his life is a tale told by an idiot, unpoetic, so on and so forth. I'm going to, again, this is going to be very fast, but basically I think one of his problems here is saying, are we to say that what literature is this sort of general repeated content or subject matter? This really reminds me of Fry. Fry would like to find recurrent patterns and say that's what's definitive of the poem and of the genre. And to be honest, that's what we call a paraphrase. And already, Clarence Brooks, whether or not he's thinking of Fry, I don't even think, this may be before Fry really gets going, is against that model, because it's like, it's not what's in common with all of the content of the poems that is really all the particularly interesting. So again, I'm going very fast here, so I'm not really going to get a lot of the nuance, but let me see if I can pick up some other aspects of this. All right, at the bottom, well, all right, next paragraph, I'm going to skip around fast. Just show you some highlights. He says, next paragraph, all right, the beauty of a poem should be considered as a whole. The latter is the effect of a total pattern of the kind of pattern which can incorporate within itself items intrinsically beautiful or ugly, attractive, and repulsive. Just going on a little bit more, next paragraph. But though it is in terms of structure that we must describe poetry, the term structure is certainly not altogether satisfactory as a term. One means it by something far more internal in the metrical pattern, say, or the sequence of images. Structure is meant not the form even. In the conventional sense, we think of form as a kind of envelope which you sort of stuff in some content. The structure is obviously everywhere conditioned by the nature of the material which goes into the poem. So he does think a structure is important, but it's the structure to this particular poem that matters. And how do the particulars match that general structure? He goes on to give you examples. He says, Pope's Rape the Lock will illustrate. The structure is not the heroic couplet, so it's not the genre or the formal, let's say, category that you fit it in. It's going to be what he says, the total effect. It's the way the heroic couplet is used. The structure of the poem, furthermore, is not that of the mock epic convention. Again, we're not going to revert to genre as the thing that is sort of the structure or the coherence or let's say, again, he says the total pattern, but it's going to be sort of all the parts of the poem considered together as a whole, achieving something. And he says this in the next paragraph. The structure is meant a structure of meanings, evaluations, and interpretations, and the principle of unity which informs it seems to be one of balance and harmonizing connotations, attitudes, and meanings. But even here one needs to make important qualifications. The principle is not one which involves the arrangement of various elements into a homogeneous grouping, pairing like with like. It unites the like with the unlike. It does not unite them, however, by the simple process of allowing one connotation to cancel out another, nor does it reduce the contradictory adverbs to the harmony by a process of subtraction. It says unity is not an algebraic formula. I'm going very fast here, but he does think that any particular work of art, novel, poem, has a sense of unity, but it's a unity of a bunch of different elements, okay? And even things that could be unlike with each other. Finally, it's a unity that achieves a kind of balance and harmony, but again, with a lot of different kind of effects. And later he'll say, including a lot of ambiguity in the next paragraph, a lot of paradox, a lot of complex attitudes, even a lot of irony. And again, going very fast, but what Clansbrook thinks is, okay, he agrees that we need a system or a method, and it needs to be more precise. And one of the things he's going to assume is that works of art are units among themselves, wholes among themselves, okay? So that you should approach the work of art as its own, let's say, self-contained work, okay? So this is already pushing away historians, because they like to defer to something else. Historical context. It's already even pushing away moralists. It's already doing exactly what John Crowe Ransom wanted, is to say we should focus on what the work is doing and how it's doing it. And for Clansbrook, the work as such is going to achieve a unity, but it's going to do it through all sorts of various effects, including ambiguity, paradox, which are not particularly unifying. They're sort of like fragmenting, even irony. And to the degree that you can have both at the same time, unity and let's say non-unity or irony, you get a better reading of any given work of art. And to read through is to do that work of balancing and harmonizing these, let's say, the particular with the general. What is this line doing with the general effect of a Shakespeare sonnet, or something like that? Let's say, for example, this is an elegy, but what's this one line doing? This one line is full of, let's say, irony or metaphor, whatever. Again, I'm going very fast, but what it's not doing is paraphrasing. It's not saying that the whole, or even something above the whole, like the summary of the whole, or what the poem is about, or the content, is going to be the achievement of the poem. It's not certain. Another version of paraphrasing, again, would be to say, well, the history matters first, and then we'll get to the poem second. That's a form of paraphrasing. The third thing, again, would be, it's like the sort of philosopher who says, okay, this poem is about, it's about happiness, or it's about death, or it's about the musical life, or it's about the pursuit of sexuality, right? Let me boil this whole poem down to one thing that it's about, whether that would be. Again, those are forms of paraphrase. And again, Clansbrook is saying, before you get to the general, you've got to explain a little bit what the particular is doing, and you've got to connect the particular to the whole, and eventually, by doing that back and forth with some ambiguity, a sense of the uniqueness of any particular device, and then how that device relates to the whole, you'll get a sense of that general work of art. That's the opposite of paraphrase. It's slowing down, it's taking time. It's not jumping to the what's this all about. It's not jumping to the most generalization you can make out of this poem. I went very fast there because I had to, and I didn't really do a good job of actually showing how he's delivering this in the text. But it's starting to make sense about sort of how we might have a method that is systematic, but not reducing itself to what we might call paraphrase or other people's systems. Right? He goes on to say it's not a work of logic, a reading. Because that would be a kind of paraphrase. If I said, like this poem is like a machine that produces elegy, or something like that. That would be a form of paraphrasing it, forcing on a logic that it doesn't do. If I might point out a few more highlights on like 1192, he says, about 12 lines from the bottom, you can recognize incongruities, and you can find ironies all over the place. The next paragraph will talk about that. And yet, ironies can achieve a kind of unity nonetheless. The way that the ironies sort of dramatize themselves, as he says finally on 1194, gives you a sense of the, let's say, unfolding experience of that particular work of art. So let's say, all right, so finally he gives an example, let's say a Tennyson poem. Like a very simple one would be Break, Break, Break. It's an elegy for his friend Arthur Hallam. And if you're talking about, that poem's all just about, the line between life and death. Summary, done. I've understood that poem. He's saying, no, it's about the dramatization, as he says. This is the paragraph on 1194, right in the middle. He must dramatize its life and death for us. and his dramatization involved necessarily ironic shock and wonder. The dramatization demands that the antithetical aspects of memory be coalesced into one entity, which is, let's say, the memory of that person. So yes, it is an edge for Arthur Hallam, but you have to go through the steps of shock, line by line, if you will, and the not sureness between what is dead and alive in that poem to get that achievement that the overall poem is aiming for. Okay, just to sum up a little bit of what's going on here, I think I want to sort of, before I get to the last Wimsatt and Beardsley, I want to say one of the impressive things about new criticism is the following. So they had this vision, again, this is 30s, 40s, 50s, the height of the popularity of this movement is to be able to teach anyone to read anything, okay? So and this means you wouldn't have to have any particular background knowledge. So you wouldn't need to know the history of Chaucer or Tennyson. You wouldn't need to know the philosophy of elegy or the philosophy of the emotion of loss or the psychology of that, Freudian melancholia or anything like that. You wouldn't need to know only the bare minimum. It helps to have the bare minimum. They're not anti-history or anti-context, but by and large, anyone could walk in and within 1 minute or 5 minutes, they would have all they need to know about this poem, and therefore the next 60 minutes could be spent on actually looking at the poem. So instead of 90% context, and let's say 10% reading, you would have the opposite. 10% context, 90% reading. And that sounds good. I actually agree with that, by and large. I don't spend my time giving you the history of Chaucer or Keats. But I do, of course, give a little bit, but I do spend 90% of the time what we call close reading. I don't spend it paraphrasing, I don't spend it referring to other fields, I spend it looking at the lines on the poem. And this is a radically, again, I said democratic, I think, mindset. Anybody can walk in the room and be taught this poem. You don't have to be white, male, rich. You don't have to have much of an education. So it doesn't even have to be in the university. It could have been in high school. And in fact, close reading, new criticism is basically what high school is, to a large extent. You don't have to be anyone with any special background. It could be anybody, and that's radically democratic. It's beautiful, I think. That anybody could be taught how to read well. I quite appreciate that. I get behind that. However, this is also the 1930s and 40s and 50s. This is the time in which politics is still communism is a raging debate. It still maybe is today, but it certainly was in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And yet they are, on the one hand, radically democratic and also very, let's say, politically cagey by saying, it's not about your moral stance per se, but it's another way of saying is don't politicize the text. Don't bring in your politics. Leave the politics at the door. Anybody can come in and be taught this text, but actually it also means when you come in, you leave your politics behind, and we just focus on the words on the page. And so you're not going to talk about leftism. You're not going to talk about your gender. You're not going to talk about your race. You're not going to talk about your history. You're going to have to leave that all at the door because we're just talking about words on the page. And that is very much, it sounds like the 1950s. And it, on the one hand, is wonderful to give that attention to the text. On the other hand, you're losing all those background that informs what you make of, why is Shakespeare using the word black to characterize this woman over and over again? Is that a racial term in Shakespeare? It would help to talk about that. And that's not history, or it's not something external to the text. So Shakespeare is actually bringing in race. And we want to talk about that. We're not going to leave that at the door. But the new critics thought that would have been something that wouldn't be germane per se. I mean, yes, it might have appeared, or it's like, how do you read like Huckleberry Finn and not talk about race? I'm sure you would have had to do it to some degree, but they would have not had a really robust theory of race to do that. They would have just said, well, there's racial elements in the text, and yet we should look at how dialect is functioning, because all these characters speak in sort of Southern dialect or Black dialect or something like that. So on the one hand, it's radically democratic. On the other hand, it's sort of anti-political or anti-democratic. That's the right word for that. On the one hand, it's very open to everyone. On the other hand, it's very elitist because it's got this mentality of like, well, actually, who can afford to go to the university? Yes, anyone can be taught it, but only certain people can arrive in that room. And English departments were very clubby in the 1950s, largely white men, still. And are they reproducing that personality over and over again if they have this new criticism method? I think that can be a risk. What if you also want to talk about, you do want to talk about emotions. You don't want to leave your emotions at the door. They would say it's the emotion in the text that matters, not your subjective response to it. Well, what if I actually do want to talk about some of my subjective connection to the text? That shouldn't be actually left at the door. It is relevant to me close reading any particular Shakespeare poem. Finally, actually, history can be helpful. Maybe it's not 90-10. Sometimes I actually need 30% history, if you will, or I do like philosophy. I spend a lot of time thinking philosophical issues, so I actually do like to bring that up. I do think it makes for better close readings, sometimes. So I don't want to leave, I actually like Freud. I don't want to leave Freud at the door because saying, well, we're only talking about these lines. Actually, Freud helps me understand those lines, and so on. So it turns out there are things I want to take with me in the room. And in fact, I actually kind of want to take everything back in the room. So whereas the model for new criticism was leave that all, because what we can, within a few minutes, I will just spread a poem that you've never seen. And you will all be able to give, helpful, knowledgeable, value-adding readings through this new critical training, because you're going to be looking for irony. You're going to be looking for metaphor. You're going to be looking for how that creates a unity out of incongruities. And you're going to be looking for dramatization, and so on and so forth. And it does sound like a repeatable method. It sounds like we've hit something very helpful for an English department. On the other hand, you've lost a lot of what we now identify as the value of the English department. I kind of walked us through some of those implications there in the dialogue just to speed up the time. We have about 5 minutes for Wimsatt and Beardsley. Last, new critical take. It's again fairly straightforward. The intentional fallacy, and it really reminds me of John Crowe Ransom, saying that isn't the artist the best judge of the artwork? That would be the intentional fallacy. What was the artist's intention? And that's what we should look for in the text. So if you want a critical anchor, what is criticism? Criticism is, what was the author's intention, and does the poem or novel achieve that intention well, or in an interesting way? So the intentional, intentionality as the stable thing that criticism will look for. And Wimsatt and Beardsley are like, that would be a terrible reading. Why, though? And here they give you a list, and I'll read it quickly from the list. So this is on 1198. So, again, he says, intention, this is sort of just before the list, intention, as we shall use the term, corresponds to what he intended in a formula which more or less explicitly has wide acceptance. In order to judge the poet's performance, we must know what he intended. Intention is the design or plan in the author's mind. Okay, but here's why it's problematic. Number one, he says, a poem does not come into existence by accident. The words of the poem come out of a head, not out of a hat. Yet to insist that the designing intellect as the cause of the poem is not to grant the designer intention as a standard. Somewhat complicated, but just to say, yes, we agree that there is an intention to the poem, but to boil that all to the design coming out of the head of somebody is a poor understanding of what intention might mean. Number two, one must ask how a critic expects to get an answer to the question about intention. How is he to find out what the poet tried to do? If the poet succeeded in doing it, then the poem itself shows what he was trying to do. And if the poet didn't succeed, then the poem is not very good evidence. So an obvious point to this second point would be like, how would you find out? You could ask the poet if they're alive. Well, guess what? 99% of what we're reading, the authors are not alive. Okay? Or even if they're alive, they're not going to want to pick up the phone to tell you. So most of the time, you're not going to be able to have an answer to the question, what was the intention? For various reasons. Number three, judging a poem is like judging a pudding or a machine. One demands that it work. These are bad metaphors, to be honest. Pudding or a machine even. It's only because an artifact works that we infer the intention of the artificer. A poem should not mean but be. That's kind of a very potentially ironic statement from Archibald MacLeish, I believe, is the poet there. Yeah, Ars Poetica. And a poem, but by the way, the poem should not mean not have a message but be might be this kind of argument, or emphasizing that there's this sort of sequence is more important than this, or something like that, and even this. However, the Windat and Beardsley point is that how does this poem work is more interesting than what was the intention of the poem. So that's why it's supposed to be like pudding or a machine. Okay, and so talking about success or even intention is sort of a side kind of analysis from what this machine is actually doing. Number 4, the meaning of a poem may be certainly a personal one. So that a mere 2 minutes or so, but the meaning of a poem might be certainly a personal one in the sense that a poem expresses a personality or state of soul rather than an object like an apple, but even a lyric poem is dramatic. The response of a speaker, no matter how abstractly conceived to a situation, no matter how universalized. We ought to compute the thoughts and attitudes of the poem immediately to the dramatic speaker, and if to the author at all, only by biographical act of inference. This is actually a fascinating point. What this gave rise to was the language you hear over and over, even still today, that this, the I in the poem is not Emily Dickinson. The I is the dramatic speaker, and you should not conflate Emily Dickinson with the I of the poem. That argument is crystallized in this just little passage right there. This became a new critical adage that you would not read the I as biographical, but you would read. It's a dramatic speaker. It's an invented character. It's this I personifying itself through the poem. And that might be largely Emily Dickinson's personhood, but it's never going to be one-to-one per se. And also, it's important that we see it as a fictive dramatization in the poem or in the novel or whoever the narrator is. Why? Well, if we actually did think of it as the biography, then we might actually be leaning towards intentionality or something like that. What was Emily Dickinson's I really saying or thinking or feeling? Well, if we put a gap between her and the I of the poem, then we will actually have room as readers to not necessarily consult her, but also to understand the dramatization of the I is more interesting than the biography of Emily. I will say that even this idea of the dramatic speaker is coming a lot of pressure. There's like a movement called New Lyric Theory in the last 20 years or so to say, who decided that the dramatic speaker was the best model for what the speaker of the poem is doing. And it seems famously this person named Virginia Jackson argues this best. And she says it's this very white theory because if you were an African-American poet, it's a lot of work to have an eye. And you are developing that in and through the novel or the poem. And then for a critic to walk up and say, hey, guess what? Your eye, it's not about your eye. It's about the dramatic speaker in the poem. You're like, well, wait a second. It took me a lot of work to get this voice, to get this sense of I. And so it's a very sort of deracinated theory that favors, if you will, kind of a white eye or an unmarked eye. I mean, it could be unmarked in any sort of way, whether that's gender or whether that's nationality or other kinds of important effects of the speaker. I think still the better argument would be, could we blend the two? Because we still don't want to read for biography over and over again. But I also want, Toni Morrison or Langston Hughes to have an I in the poem that is meaningful, or in the novel, that matters to that it is Toni Morrison who wrote this, or something like that. All right, finally he goes on, it says, if there's any sense in which an author by revision has a better achieved his original intention, is only by an abstract, tautological sense that the poem is actually now better. All right, I'm not going to belabor that point. Anyways, he goes on to sort of show some more examples of this, how to make sense of this. I think it's a fairly straightforward argument that the intentional quality of the poem is not the most interesting thing. Also, by the way, your personal, let's say, intentional, if that's the right word, or subjective reaction. He says this more in 1204. It's not about your personal evaluation. If it's not about your sincerity or fidelity or spontaneity or authenticity or so on and so forth, because you get in the problem of it's not the author's subjective intention. It's not your subjective intention. Can we not have some form of objective, let's say, repeatable, more precise methods? I think that makes sense to the degree that it cannot be individual based, whether it's your intention or the author's intention, whether it's your subjectivity or their subjectivity. However, on the other hand, my subjectivity matters. The author's subjectivity actually does matter, and we should still be able to read that meaningfully. But I get why he's overcorrecting here and saying let's get rid of the intentional fallacy altogether to some extent, because we need that overcorrection so that we don't fall in the trap of thinking that the author has the best view. Finally, he puts it very well on the very last page, 1211 here. He says, all right, I'll read this about 6 or 7 sentences. It says, nevertheless, we must submit that this is the true and objective way of criticism, as contrasted to what the very uncertainty of exegesis might tempt the second kind of critic to undertake. That is, the way of biographical or genetic inquiry, in which, taking advantage of the fact that T.S. Eliot is still alive, this is 1946, and in the spirit of the man who would settle a bet, the critic writes to T.S. Eliot and asks what he meant. Or if he had John Donne in mind, same thing, basically. Or sorry, if T.S. Eliot had John Donne in mind, hey, when you wrote that line, were you thinking of John Donne? If so, that's the best reading of that line. We shall not here weigh the probabilities, whether Eliot would answer that he meant nothing at all, or that he had nothing in mind. Maybe you ask Eliot and he gives you a boring, stupid answer. So guess what? You're going to be disappointed. It says a sufficiently good answer to such a question, or in an unguarded moment might furnish a clear and within its limit irrefutable answer. So Eliot may even give you a better answer, or he may give you a terrible answer. Either way, it's not going to help you. It says our point is that such an answer to such an inquiry would have nothing to do with the poem Prufrock. It would not be a critical inquiry. That's where the journal critical inquiry comes from. Critical inquiries, unlike bets, are not settled in this way. Critical inquiries are not settled by consulting the oracle. I think it's nicely phrased at the end there, and I actually still agree with that. So again, I'm not going to call up Margaret Atwood and ask her what she meant by that line, because that's not, that doesn't sound like criticism to me. That's authorial intention, and I would always have to defer anything I could possibly say about that novel to Margaret Atwood. And if that's true, then she's the only expert. But then that's not repeatable. That's not an English department. We're not all on Margaret Atwood's. And again, I think it makes the case that there is something different that literary criticism, or whatever, I'll call it literary theory, so I can avoid the word criticism, is slightly different than what the artist's creative act is doing, even though they're both creative acts. And this argument, I think, gives us a little bit of room to make that case.